This right here is an emulator. Now, sorry to start by beating you with the assuming you're stupid stick, but it is quite an old emulator, as you can tell by the sheer DOSness of it. Specifically, it's a ZX Spectrum emulator called Warajevo, and it's the first emulator that I ever properly used. I'd heard about how emulation allowed you to play old arcade games through programs like MAME, after that was featured in just about every mid-late 90s game magazine going, but I didn't have a computer anywhere near good enough for that, nor was it really good enough for using 16-bit console emus like Genesis or ZSNES. However, as old and creaky as it was, it turned out that it was good enough to emulate my first ever machine, one that I had no way of playing at that time because my real Spectrum had broke and all my games were up in a loft in black bags, and as it turns out, covered in rat droppings. World of Spectrum was my guiding light, the place where I picked this program out from a list of the various emulators available, and then set about downloading all the games I remembered and plenty else besides from their A to Z. Seeing as the file size of these various TAPs, TZXs and Z80 images wasn't ever any higher than a little over 100 kilobytes or so, it wasn't all that stressful for my 56k modem either. I loved Warajevo, and I spent a pretty decent chunk of time using it. It was, in many ways, my first real introduction to emulation, something that, if I'm honest, has been more important to me than anything else in gaming. The idea that, even if you didn't have your old systems anymore, you could still play those games was, well, huge to me. Back then, it was the thing that I now used to play the likes of School Days or 3D Death Chase, and now seeing it in action has a whole other level of nostalgia. But there is something else lurking here, something hidden in plain sight that should be plainly obvious by the emulator's name, although as a teenager who only cared about playing my old favourites, it never quite registered back then. Warajevo has quite the story behind it when it comes to the program's creation, something that's unique to it. Yes, as with many emulators, it's the work of hackers, a passion project, something produced as part of a hobby that you're dedicated to. It's your spare time. But that's much more significant when your work time involves being on the defensive lines of one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 1990s, in a city under constant bombardment where even the most basic foundations of living are hardly guaranteed. Warajevo came from Sarajevo circa 1993, right in the middle of the Bosnian War, and the story of this program, and the duo who created it, as they have told it various times over the years, is quite amazing. To understand the whys of Warajevo's creation, it's important to at least have a little look at the state of emulation back then. For a lot of people, there isn't much of a history for emulation beyond the time when MAME was introduced to the public consciousness in 1997, and everyone became aware that they could now play Pac-Man on their PCs. But it goes back a lot further. In fact, the first ever available emulator was made by IBM for their 709 mainframe computer all the way back in 1958, and it allowed programs for their earlier 704 computer to be emulated, programs that a lot of old 704 users would still wish to use on their newer systems, something heavily desired in the commercial and scientific establishments where such a computer would be used. Emulation as it relates to computers has always been about a bit more than just playing games. Certainly from the 1980s onwards, with computers now smaller and more accessible, it became a worthwhile pursuit for plenty of hackers. Can you get a machine that, for example, runs on Z80 code, to run this piece of software that was made for, say, the 6502? That's the sort of experiment we're dealing with here. To create an intermediary, a program that'll allow that entirely different software to run on a machine that it wasn't designed for. A worthwhile pursuit indeed, and you can find all manner of these experiments from the 80s and early 90s, some of which even made it to magazines and the like. This feels like a good place to introduce our two Bosnian coders, Željko Juric and Samir Ribic, creators of the Warajevo emulator and, as you might expect, ardent Speccy fans. At this time, in the early 90s, Željko and Samir were both in their mid-20s and studying at the University of Sarajevo's Faculty of Electrical Engineering, but as the Bosnian War began in 1992, their studies would be turned upside down. The story of how Warajevo was made can be pieced together a fair bit. Željko and Samir have both written about it a couple of times over the years, including on the World of Spectrum website. They note that they originally became aware of emulators for the ZX Spectrum in 1991, not long after they had both acquired IBM PC-ATs, for a rather obscure and not very fast DOS emulator of Slovenian origin. This emulator was called Roman ZX, written by Peter Krsej, and reportedly it could be found on Serbian bulletin boards in the summer of that year. Even if this emulator was very early, low on features and quite slow, the mere existence of it appears to have attracted some attention, including from Željko and Samir. And eventually they wondered if they could create a better DOS-based emulator. Development on what would become Warajevo officially began in February of 1993, and Samir gave the program its name in June. It appears that, for a long time, Roman ZX was the pair's only reference point as far as other Speccy emulators went. After war broke out and Sarajevo was put under what would be a years-long siege by the Serbian forces, they certainly didn't have much in the way of access to the internet, or indeed much information at all. Because of this, they did miss what was undoubtedly the breakthrough moment for Speccy emulation in most of the world, the release of Gurton A. Lunter's legendary Z80 emulator in the middle of 1993. This shareware program was several orders faster and more accurate than any Speccy emulator that had come before it, and generated a whole load of attention in Speccy communities and beyond. Lunter's Z80 was a whole new ballgame, and it has rightly taken its place in the pantheon of the most important emulators of the decade. Željko and Samir only heard of Lunter's emulator in late 1993 through magazines that had come from the enemy's territory, well after they'd started working on Warajevo. They recognised that if they had been aware of Z80's existence before they'd started, they might not have begun work on the program at all. Beyond just trying to see if they could do better than the 1991 vintage Slovenian Spectrum emulator that they'd come across, Željko and Samir's work did have a greater meaning for them. This attempt to bring life to the microcomputer that they'd loved, and that they credited for their own interests in the sciences, the catalyst not just for their academic studies but for what they would do after Warajevo, was by their own admission a link to better times. The times before the war, the times that were spent simply enjoying the ZX Spectrum and hacking away at a computer. Taking whatever snatches of time they had in this period to work on Warajevo was a way to forget about the very real horrors that surrounded them, to, in their words, remove the dark thoughts from their heads. And they were indeed snatches, for Warajevo was created under exceptionally trying conditions. Both Željko Đurić and Samir Ribić were in the army and doing their part for Sarajevo's defence, for a start. And while Željko largely worked on the program at home, it was only something that could be worked on intermittently, whenever electricity was available. Not only was that not guaranteed, it was often brief. At best, there were a couple of hours at night, and certainly not every night. Meanwhile, Samir was working on the program at the army base itself, again reliant on the fleeting nature of electricity and the reliability, or lack of improvised generators. Working on Warajevo was something to do, if possible, between duties and missions. As we'll get into, this sort of situation can create quite a lot of technical challenges, but it can, as we will see, also result in challenges that represent a very real threat to human life. Make no mistake, these two people quite literally risked their lives in order to create this emulator. To start with the challenges that were relatively lighter in the grand scheme of things, well, what about storage? If you're Samir Ribić, using the hard drive in your PC to store your work was pretty much out of the question. Electricity wasn't just fleeting, it was fragile when it was there, especially when you consider that the power generator at the army camp was essentially a hacked-up car engine. If someone did something as innocuous as, say, make coffee, put the kettle on, well, chances are that's probably going to affect the power going to Samir's computer, crashing the system. Needless to say, the frequency of these crashes made short work of the hard drive in his PC. That got fried in a hurry. And so Samir largely had to work on Warajevo with the help of a dozen or so closely guarded floppy disks used as sparingly as possible, not just to conserve them, but to protect them from possible viruses. Even though there was little prospect of having any more floppies available than what Samir already had to hand, they'd proved to be much more reliable than a hard drive in a situation like his one. Samir's primary tasks involved working on utilities for the emulator such as ZX tools that would convert and compress tape files for use in the emulator. Such files and algorithms for compression were most certainly necessary, especially considering that they had so little actual storage space to work with, not to mention the whole floppy disk situation. While Jaco did have a working 30MB hard drive at his home PC alongside a 128K Spectrum, there wasn't any kind of generator there, so while his PC was a bit more stable and as such he could work on the emulator's kernel, again I have to stress, at best he's got a couple of hours a night of actual power, and when the power's off it could easily take days if not weeks for it to come back on. Not that this necessarily stopped everything. There is pen and paper after all, and both Jaco and Samir made use of that to work when there wasn't any power at all. And what's described here is basically about as good as conditions get. As the pair describe in their story, there were times when the conditions were a lot worse. Conditions in Sarajevo at this time were unspeakably horrible. During the worst periods of the siege there was no electricity, no water, and barely any supplies for months on end. The simple act of getting whatever supplies were available was fraught with danger. Hundreds of shells and grenades were indiscriminately fired into the city by the Serbian army every single day, and in the very worst incidents they could kill scores of civilians in an instant, people who were simply gathering at the city's marketplaces. Many of the streets in Sarajevo were no-go areas. They were riddled with the Srpska nationalist snipers, shooting at anything moving. And even beyond the enemy, the battles in the streets and the mortar blasts, there was basically no civil order. All services had completely collapsed. In the midst of this humanitarian crisis, and while also doing their duties, Jaco and Samir did what they could when it came to Warajevo, whenever they had the chance to, but this was also fraught with danger. When it came to transferring Spectrum software for use in Warajevo, Samir had to go to software pirates in order to borrow cassettes, places that were located virtually on the front lines of combat, which Samir had to reach by travelling through the riverbed. It was far too dangerous to use the streets thanks to sniper fire. In the worst parts of the siege, the pair, as with many others, were changing as people. With scarcely any food available, by their accounts Jaco and Samir were losing a kilogram of weight every week. But even in these most horrid of conditions, particularly in the frozen winters, despite the combat operations that they took part in, they still persisted. The link back to normality that working on Warajevo provided was far too important to give up. After a year and a half or so of work, and despite all that they had endured, Jaco and Samir were ready to release the first version of Warajevo in November of 1994. The Bosnian War was still very much going on, but there was more contact with the outside world. In April of 94, thanks to the intervention and funding provided by the Open Society Foundation, it was now possible for people to access an email service. It's certainly not flawless infrastructure, but it's there. Through this, Jaco and Samir were finally able to get their hands on a copy of Gerten Lunter's Z80 emulator, as well as information on a great deal of the other Spectrum emulators that were already out there. Now that they had a measuring stick, they found that they could be very pleased with their work. With barely any frames of reference, and despite the terrible conditions that they were working in, the pair had created an emulator that was faster and more usable than any other available one, with the exception of the Z80. Warajevo's performance was still very comparable to the full version of Lunter's program. In the original readme for the 1.1 version, they estimated that Warajevo was around 15 to 30% slower than the full version of Z80, although a lot of that depended on what software or game was running. Compared to other emulators of the time, a difference of 15 to 30% between Warajevo and Z80 was still very playable, and the pair estimated that their emulator was 7 times faster than the Roman ZX emulator that they'd originally encountered. Now it should be noted here, when showing 1.5, that the nature of my virtual machine means that programs tend to run way too fast here, rather than slowly. Also, Z80 could have a lot of settings changed on the fly, and it emulated many peripherals and add-ons that Warajevo did not at first, such as the micro drive, although emulation for a lot of these peripherals would be added in due course. Now, on the other hand, Warajevo had some serious positives. The ability to load up any program instantly, for example, and it could handle multi-load programs a great deal better than Z80 could due to its superior tape emulation. The tools that were initially included with Warajevo, such as ZX Tools and ZX Shell, also gave users many other options, such as the ability to convert tapes to other formats, or to maintain a clean database of games that made startup even easier. In later versions of Warajevo, these utilities would be incorporated directly into the program itself. The very first version of Warajevo was released in November of '94 with the help of Gurten Lunter himself, after the pair had been able to contact him and request a copy of his emulator. He was full of praise for their work, agreed with their assessment of how Warajevo compared to Z80, and helped to distribute the original program. Work on the 1.x versions of Warajevo would continue over the remainder of the siege and the war, resulting in 1.1 and 1.2. 1.2 was released in December of '95, right about the time that the conflict was coming to an end. The signing of the Dayton Accords on the 14th of December helped to stabilise the situation somewhat by ending the Bosnian War, and on the 29th of February '96 the Siege of Sarajevo was officially lifted with the exit of all Srpska troops from the city. July '96 saw the release of Warajevo 1.5. This version was an important step forward, consolidating utilities such as ZX Tools and ZX Shell into the main Warajevo program, and also allowing users to load software from a real tape recorder if desired. Following the release of 1.5, it would be a considerable amount of time before the release of another version. Željko and Sabir stressed in their story that even though the war was over, conditions in Sarajevo were still a long way from ideal, to say the least. Before the siege began, it was estimated that 435,000 people had lived in the city, and after 3.5 years that number was now down to as little as 300,000. Željko and Samir, along with many others who were left, had lives to rebuild. There were also studies to complete. For Samir Ribic, the 3 years that had been spent up to that point working on Warajevo provided the basis for his final thesis on emulation, specifically emulating the ZX Spectrum on PC-ATs, providing a full detail on the work that went into the program. He and Željko graduated from their studies with flying colours. Despite the poor conditions that existed long after the war, the pair still continued work on Warajevo. A long part of the delay from 1.5 to 2.0 was down to saving up enough money so that the pair could upgrade their computer equipment, finally being able to purchase new PCs after a time. With this, Željko and Samir had finally achieved their main goal. They now had the power to update Warajevo and make it a proper real-time Spectrum emulator, accurate to the original speed of the microcomputer, regardless of the machine that it was running on. Requirements-wise, the 2.0 version of the program required a processor of 33 MHz or more to run optimally, and happily this makes 2.0 and later versions much easier to deal with in the rather overpowered virtual PC that I'm using to emulate this emulator. Version 2.0, released in February of 1998, also allowed much greater compatibility. In earlier versions of the program, it was impossible to run .tape files that had been created in the Lunter Z80 format, and they had to be converted to what Warajevo used, a format confusingly also named .tape, but considerably different because, again, they hadn't initially been aware of the Z80 emulator. This was now no longer an issue. By this time, the pair were also aware of the great work that had been achieved by others in the field. There was a nod, for example, to James Mackay's excellent X128 emulator, originally released in 1996, and another very significant program in the world of Speccy emulation. Version 2.51, released in November of 1998, would be the final release of the program. By this stage, Warajevo also emulated the Timex Sinclair 2068, the first emulator to do so, alongside the traditional 48K and 128K options, and it also officially had a home on the internet as part of the World of Spectrum website, as it was originally run by Martin van der Heide, back in the days when its address was still void.daemon.nl. The archives for the Warajevo website do happily still exist on the WOS site as it is now, including all the documentation, the various versions of the program, the story of its creation, and even Samir Ribic's university thesis, all of which has naturally been quite a help when it comes to compiling this video. Happily, at least for me, Warajevo is still very much accessible. It's easy enough to run using a virtual PC system along the lines of PCM, and it'll happily run there just as well as it did on my old goat of a PC back in the day. Well, so long as I don't forget to set the program to full screen so that I don't get a load of garbage whenever I try to load up a game. Of course, Speccy emulation has moved on a lot since the days of Warajevo, Z80 and X128. There are programs such as Fuse or Spectaculator that are obviously a great deal more fully featured. But even now, Warajevo, shown here in its final 2.51 presentation, is still a fine emulator. It is ridiculously easy to use, after all. There's not much in the way of configuration required, you just hit start, choose a file, and you're away, playing a game instantly. This was certainly handy for the 13-year-old me, completely lacking in any kind of patience and just wanting to load up Chucky Egg here without any fuss whatsoever. Now, of course, there are inaccuracies, and the compatibility is not exactly 100%. The emulation of the beeper sound isn't particularly accurate to the Speccy, but it does still have a nice dirty sound to it. Here's some comparisons between Warajevo and Spectaculator, so you can hear it for yourself. The program is certainly better when dealing with 48K programs, primarily because Warajevo does struggle a fair bit with emulating the AY chip. Said chip wasn't something that Jaco and Samir were hugely aware of, focusing more on emulating the beeper. So yes, anything that uses AY sound can become a little bit of a mess. Out of curiosity, I did try to run a few more modern Speccy games on this old DOS emulator, and I ended up with mixed results. Zosia's excellent Angels and Valley of Rains both ran flawlessly, as did TCQ. Castlevania Spectral Interlude and Mighty Final Fight didn't. They both crashed out pretty quickly. Again though, this is probably down to Warajevo being more comfortable in the 48K environment than anything else. But of course, all of this is neither here nor there. We are talking about a ZX Spectrum emulator from the mid-late 90s, let alone one that was created in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the middle of a war. As Jaco and Samir admit in Warajevo's README, the very fact that the program came from the city of Sarajevo, made during the course of a 3-year siege, is likely more interesting to people than the program itself. Over the course of my research on Warajevo, I managed to find an old post by Samir Ribic from March 2003 on the comp.sys.sinclair group. Aside from revealing some more details about working on the programme, Samir also mentions that he and Jaco had recently visited a pizzeria in order to commemorate 10 years since development began on Warajevo. In the years since, both have mainly worked as lecturers at the University of Sarajevo, and with it now being over 30 years since development of the programme began, hopefully such anniversaries are still celebrated, even if it all must feel like a lifetime ago. The personal memories of using Warajevo certainly came flooding back when I came to boot it up once again, to see just how it still held up. It is after all one of the main programs that introduced me to the world of emulation, and for that I will always remember it and give it eternal credit. The story of the program as a whole though? Well, that's a reminder of just how creativity and dedication to a craft can still exist and thrive even in the most demanding, the most terrible of situations. How important it is to have that link to a normality that, even in the darkest hours, people work towards getting back to. I can only end this by simply saying, if they ever happen to watch this, a big thank you to Jaco Juric and Samir Ribic for what they achieved. Thank you for watching, as always, and I hope you enjoyed this story. Bye for now.